You are listening to Nerd Best Friends, a podcast that covers the nerdy conversations you're already having, or wish you could. It's the nerdiest thing you'll do this week.
Welcome back, nerds. This is Nerd Best Friends. I am Analese, here with my best friend, Rob.
Hey, it's me, Rob, your best friend, your podcast host, and your guy who inadvertently uses 90s catchphrases all the time. The Nerd Best Friends podcast can be found on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and more. Subscribe and follow us now.
This is Season 2, Episode 22, and today we continue our conversation nerd-watching television and movies from the 1990s, the decade of rad.
Vince Scully would say, Deuces Wild. Season 2, Episode 22, Deuces Wild. Remember Vince Scully? R.I.P. Two out, second inning, man on second, 2 balls, 2 strikes, Deuces Wild here at Dodger Stadium.
What's crazy about Vince Scully is you don't have to be a Dodger fan for him to have been part of your childhood. Everybody knows that voice.
Everybody knows Vince Scully because on the national games, they would get him to do it.
The other is the voice of the Lakers.
It's Chick Hearn.
Chick Hearn, yep. And
I wish I had a good Vince Scully impression. I would have to really work on it. My baseball announcer impression is actually Bob Uecker, another amazing 80s name.
That's a blast from the past for sure. Chick Hearn, my favorite. I mean, growing up watching Lakers games, and again, that's a voice that a lot of people attribute to basketball, and particularly Lakers basketball. But I'll never forget when the game was closed out. His little catchphrase, the refrigerator door's closed, the jello is jiggling.
The jello's jiggling.
Yeah, that's definitely parts of our childhood. But today we were talking about movies because last episode we nerded out about TV shows from the 90s. But today we're going to focus on movies, not sports games on television, unfortunately. Before we get there, how about Rob's recommendation?
Yeah, this week I want to recommend another podcast that I think would complement this one very well, and that is Geek History Lesson. The Geek History Lesson podcast is a couple that tries to be very timely as far as what's going on in pop culture, movies, TV, comic books, those kinds of things, and gives you a deep dive into those different characters or those different properties. For instance, when the new Thor movie comes out, they're going to do a geek history lesson all about Valkyrie. When She-Hulk is going to come out on TV, they'll do a geek history lesson about She-Hulk. It's a great primer if you are looking at these kinds of properties and see like, oh, there's a lot of buzz about this new Lord of the Rings show, but I don't really know much about it. It might be interesting. Geek history lesson, like a week ahead of time, will give you this perfect primer where they give you right in the beginning, like a 10-cent origin, which sometimes is enough. You're like, oh, okay, cool. And then you skip the rest of the episode. Or after that, they keep going into deeper and deeper dives as far as the history of the character that they're talking about, the different comic books. There's a lot of superhero stuff, and they always give recommended reading at the end. So like on their Wonder Woman episode that they did years and years ago, I listened to that before the first Wonder Woman movie came out, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. He's got me all hyped up on Wonder Woman. I took their recommended reading as well as some other lists and put together like my reading list for Wonder Woman that I shared around with people and stuff like that. It's a great resource. It's a great podcast. Geek History Lesson podcast.
That sounds really great. Is it as entertaining as Drunk History?
No, I will say that
kind of entertaining.
These podcasters, they're Hollywood people, like they're here in Southern California. I think the dude is like a writer. The lady is an actor, but not a comedy writer and not a comedian. So no, not quite, not the same vibe. They're great, but they're not comedians.
That sounds awesome, especially if you're new to getting into something that's coming out, right? I've never read the Thor.
And there's a huge log. So when you are interested in something like, oh, you know what? I don't really know much about Robin. Like I picked up a Batman comic and there's like Dick Grayson Robin that I remember from the movies, but then there's also Tim Drake Robin and there's Damian Wayne Robin. And then there's this Red Hood guy who I think was... You go back into Geek History Lesson and their titles are very clear. So you can just scroll through like, oh, here's the one about Damian Wayne. What's his deal? It's almost like an audio encyclopedia of nerd stuff.
Ooh, there's a 90s word, encyclopedia.
All right, so we got any nerd mail, any feedback this week?
We have a nerd correction from a listener. If you recall, we were talking about Scream, and you had mentioned that you thought Scream was a parody, and we started talking about one of the actual parodies from the 90s called Not Another Teen Movie and the young Chris Evans.
Right.
And what the listener believes, and I agree, that we were actually referring to Scary Movie and the Scary Movie franchise from the Wayans brothers that stars Anna Faris. So Scary Movie is actually a direct parody of Scream. And I think I believe we were thinking about that, but talking about none other Scary Movie. And so that was brought out by a listener.
I believe that 100%.
So speaking of Scream, let's just dive right into the episode. On my list of one of the great nerd movies from the 90s is Scream. And I call it a nerd movie on my behalf because I'm such a horror fan. This is the movie that really brought back good horror genre movies. And no disrespect to all of the other horror movies that existed before 1996 when Scream came out. We had a lot of slasher movies and a lot of just gore. And Scream, which was written by Kevin Williamson, just brought storytelling horror back. It is a slasher movie that at the same time makes fun of slasher movies. It is smart. It is good. This first one came out and really brought the horror genre back to the pop culture limelight.
I have seen this movie once. I remember watching this movie with you, and I think it was at your parents' house, but the timing of it might have been in your college apartment. But I feel like I remember sitting on that sectional
that circular couch. Yep.
Yeah, at your parents' house as I was scared to death.
That was. It is very likely. Here's what I remember. I went and saw this movie with our friend Coach and our friend Ryan Jordan. A shout out to both of them. So it was my freshman year of college and went with them to the movie. I remember we went to a really late showing and it was in LA because that's where I went to college. I had to use the restroom after. And there is a scene in the school bathroom that's very intense in the movie. And I walk in and just see these empty stalls all the way down. I'm like, oh no. Oh no. I was truly, truly scared by this movie being 18 years old living in Los Angeles. And I went home to an empty apartment because my freshman year, I didn't have great roommates. We got mismatched by the college. And so I go home and it's just an empty apartment. I'm like, oh no. It was not good, but I liked the movie enough. I am more than sure that when I was home for that summer, we all got together and rented it on VHS and watched it again. So your memory is
that's what I'm thinking.
Very, very correct. But yes, and I remembered renting this and you didn't say Rob doesn't like scary movies. We'll get it anyways. He'll be fine. I totally remember that.
Me just sinking into that couch oh god. All
but
right.
it does a great job. And you remember the scary stuff. The thing to really point out that's nerdy is it just puts we talked about tropes last episode and we talk about tropes a lot. It points out every trope in a horror movie while also having those tropes happen in the movie. It's just a really brilliant way to look at horror movies and it's really good.
I do very often like movies that point the finger back at itself or, put lampshades on the things that they're doing like that. And I also very much enjoy things like that.
Yes.
I'm going to go with 1995's Billy Madison.
Woot woot.
One of the movies absolutely essential to our friendship, our sense of humor, and just the absolute goofiness and weird times that we had back in the 90s. Billy Madison was definitely the first Adam Sandler movie that I saw before falling in love with Adam Sandler, who was just having his heyday in the mid to late 90s. His comedy albums, the other movies, Happy Gilmore leading to 50 First Dates, The Water Boy, Big Daddy I like very much as well. I even like the movie Bulletproof because it still has quotable lines.
Okay.
They're not good. They don't hold up. But man, oh man, in the 90s, I watched those movies so many times. I mean, I had a shelf with the VHS tapes lined up there, and they would just be constantly going.
I don't know what you're talking about. I still constantly watch these. If I need a good movie to have on while I'm cleaning or running errands, I'll put Billy Madison on. I'll put Happy Gilmore on. They are streaming on a lot of mostly Netflix right now because Adam Sandler's production company has a whole so many film deal with Netflix. It's really funny to talk to people about 10 years younger than us and even younger than that, because Adam Sandler is this like hit or miss with people. People were like, oh no, I can't stand him. Or yeah, he's really funny. And we all know the movies aren't great, but his comedy coming out of SNL and Billy Madison was the first that he kind of wrote and ran. And then Happy Gilmore was second. And then he creates his production company, which is Happy Madison
Productions, which is what all those movies are made.
Which is now all of those. So this was the start of it. And yet we quote this all the time. I've got a tangent and tell a story. Very early on in your relationship with your wife, Maria, I think you guys might have been married by this point, but I don't quite remember. It was right before or right after you got married. You were newlyweds. And I remember hanging out at your place. And this was before you had Andrew. So this is pre-kids. And we're hanging out, who knows, I don't know, watching TV, watching a movie, eating some food, who knows. Maria's in the kitchen and she yells something like, Analese, blah, 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 blah. And I, as I always constantly do, as do you, quote this movie. I said to her, don't tell me my business, devil woman. And I hear her like slam down her like knife or whatever she was like stirring with or whatever. And she comes out of the kitchen. She goes, what did you just say to me? And I look at her and I said, don't tell me my business, devil woman. She goes, where did you get that? Where does that come from? And I explain like, oh, it's Billy Madison. And it's this scene about them leaving burning dog poop on an old man's door. And his wife says, don't stop. Like I go through the whole scene with her. And she goes, because Robert tells me that all the time. And we both just died laughing. I mean, oh, that's one of my favorite movies. What is one of my favorite memories of hanging out with you two early on. But yeah, we both quote this to death
at all.
On those mornings, my senior, your junior year, that the standardized testing was happening and we didn't have to be there. I remember coming to your house at like 8:30 in the morning and we had Spider-Man cereal and we had donut holes and we watched Billy Madison.
100%.
Amazing. That's a great way to start.
Yep, absolutely. Everything that you just said. Yeah, like that Netflix deal has been awesome for him. I have not been keeping up with his career since really the early 2000s, but that's where all that memory is, from the Saturday Night Live stuff to the comedy albums to those movies. Just screams 90s.
And I think his movies really largely still do. I've watched some of the Netflix things, not all of them. It's really, again, yeah, I think you used the good word, keep up. It's really hard to keep up with everything he's producing, but I also appreciate some of the things that he's not in. So there's a movie called House Bunny with Anna Faris, is one of my favorite movies, like funny comedy movie about a pretty ditzy blonde playboy bunny who gets kicked out of the house inadvertently and then has to figure out what to do with her life. And she ends up being a house mother for like a misfit group of sorority girls who are about to have their chapter closed down, tries to save their chapter. But it's funny because it's full of what I like to call the Adam Sandler troupe of people, right? He gets a lot of the same people in a lot of the same films, and it's really fun. Like, oh, that's the person who was the quarterback in Waterboy and the 10-second Tom, and he's this and he's this. It's his family of friends, and now even his children are in the movies, like blended. And so it's really fun to see that troupe, and it's really fun to see other movies that Happy Madison has produced that don't have Billy Madison or don't have Adam Sandler in it. This movie helped kickstart a whole self-made genre of comedy, and I really appreciate it. Even to this day, it is still my style of humor.
My impression is that the secret sauce that he's figured out is with those actors, letting them go and letting them improvise in such a way that he's able to capture a balance of good writing and just off the wall silliness, you know, when the penguin is just walking around like that had to have happened. What is that even about? Right. That was not written. That was something that like behind the scenes, just, you know, how you just squirrel off something. And then they're like, you know what? Let's just cut out the middle part and put Farley in a penguin costume. It'll be great.
And, you know, we talked about that a little bit last episode too, about how comedy movies and television shows now are really written with a loosely based script and the actors just improv. I think a lot of that comes from the guys who wrote The State. A lot of that comes from Happy Madison, the culture of Saturday Night Live, to just riff and make stuff funny, which is why their bloopers are amazing. If you ever watch bloopers from these comedy movies.
What do you got next?
So I will say, when I put my list together, I kind of did things in groupings. So with Scream, I put Silence of the Lambs. Not really a nerdy movie unless you like scary movies. So if you're a horror nerd and you haven't seen Silence of the Lambs, it's terrifying. watch it. You won't sleep for days. My next little grouping is science fiction, sci-fi, high fantasy. And I'm just going to list off what I put in here because some of these I know exist and I haven't seen. So I'll start with the ones I've seen. There's Men in Black, which now is a franchise because it has 2 or 3 films, which I didn't.
Groundbreaking at the time, Men in Black, like things nobody was seeing before.
Absolutely. And I know it's tropes, right? The whole we're going to erase your memory so you don't remember what you've seen are tropes that existed in books, fiction, comic books. But that kind of storyline, yes, people went nuts for Men in Black in the 90s. There's Fifth Element, which I hadn't seen until much later, but again, very
incredible,
edgy storyline that the typical pop culture person hadn't seen.
Kind of post-apocalyptic, kind of future tech.
Yeah.
Visually stunning, just amazing costumes, awesome sets, and just a saturated color palette throughout the whole thing. Very cool movie. Again, one of those things like it was unlike anything else we were seeing in science fiction at that time.
Independence Day. Independence Day is a little bit in that category as well, but it's...
Welcome to Earth!
Yeah. I remember watching this one, like maybe Arlington and just a room full of people. And you have Bill Pullman, not Paxton, right? Yeah. Bill Pullman with his, "This is our Independence Day." And the crowd just going crazy. Like it's 90s to the max. You look at it now and I think you show it to Andrew. I think he'll be bored because
we planned on watching it this summer on Independence Day. And then something happened and we didn't, but maybe this year.
Yeah. He might be like, he'll roll his eyes because he'll know the tropes so cleanly. That type of stuff, again, wasn't being shown very often in pop culture in the 90s. So because spoof movies were very big in the 90s as well, Mars Attacks, which is a direct spoof of Independence Day. I loved Mars Attacks. It's funny. It's okay. But I loved it at the time.
It is a throwback to the 50s monster movies. Yes. I don't know. I think it would be done even better today, but there is something so cool about that, whatever genre that is. And I'm not exactly sure what to call it besides 50s monster movies where like the monster wins, right? There's some like very loose thing like, oh, there was a meteor that crashed and now Little Shop of Horrors is one of these as well, right? It doesn't have a happy ending. The best ending for the monster movie is like, well, no, the blob destroyed the city and everybody died. You know, that kind of genre, whatever that is awesome. And I love it.
Well, not to spoil it for anyone who hasn't seen it, Mars Attacks does end with all their brains exploding because they figure out what song. It's like some old 50s country song that makes their heads explode. But yes, until that moment, there was no way to defeat these aliens and everyone's gonna die, and they really hung their hat on that.
Love it.
But you're right, yeah, it's good stuff.
Great choice.
I will also throw in there Lost in Space and Star Trek, which were franchises that existed before the 90s, but I do know had a little bit of a renaissance in the 90s to help kickstart a whole new generation of people loving Star Trek and Lost in Space. I believe you've probably seen. I think you've seen those.
Oh yeah, I've seen the Lost in Space movie. Wouldn't recommend it. I've seen all the Star Trek movies. They're fun for kitsch sake. The new Lost in Space Netflix show, newish Lost in Space Netflix show, worth a watch. I think there's 3 seasons. First season, like, really nails it. Second season, I think, was pretty good. And then the pandemic happened and everything shut down. And they were like, okay, these kids are too old now. We got to like wrap this up. So the third season is just like bam, 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 bam to the end. I think it's worth a watch. I think it's the best version of Lost in Space from like the 60s TV show to that 90s movie to now. Like if I were going to go back and watch one, it would be this most modern one for sure.
That's a mid-episode Rob's recommendation.
There you go.
So that was my little blurb about sci-fi movies that were really popular or that I really liked in the 90s. What is the next on your list?
I don't know why. Maybe we'll explore it. The movie is 1991's What About Bob, starring Bill Murray and Richard Dreyfuss. This is a comedy about Bill Murray plays this person who is just riddled with anxiety and needs a therapist. Something happened with his old therapist, so he has to get a new one, and he's just in his house and he's terrified to leave, and he's got all these different problems. He has a goldfish that is like his comfort support animal, and he has to reach out and he has to get help. So his therapist that is leaving him gives him a recommendation. He's got to go meet the new therapist, which is Richard Dreyfuss. Bill Murray being just the sweetest, most nervous man. He puts his goldfish in a little plastic goldfish bowl that hangs from a lanyard so he can wear it around his neck everywhere he goes, and gets in the elevator and he goes and meets Richard Dreyfuss and they hit it off. And he says, okay, well, I'm going on vacation with my family, so I will see you in 2 weeks. And Bill Murray he can't deal with it. So he calls the emergency line. And Richard Dreyfuss, I'm on vacation with my family. You're going to be fine. Read my book. Everything will be great. Okay. And he goes, and so then, Richard Dreyfuss is there, his family, his 2 kids, they're out on the lake someplace, or maybe in the ocean and on the East Coast, maybe the Hamptons. I don't know I remember where they are, but there. And then there's just this scene of Bill Murray showing up with the book in his hand. Hey, I read your book. It's great! And just joins in on the family vacation. Richard Dreyfuss is just freaking out the whole time. He's having these, he can do that thing. He could just turn his face super red and the vein comes popping out of his forehead. But the family, of course, loves Bill Murray and they adore him and they just welcome him in. And it's just this comedy of errors, and it ends, of course, with like a sweet, happy ending and all of these things. It's a great family movie. It's a really funny comedy, totally 90s, just 2 amazing 90s actors doing their thing. High recommend. What About Bob?
I know I've seen this movie. I am surprised I don't know it better, but I know I watched it in the 90s at some point. I'm very intrigued that it's on it's on your list as a favorite. So probably going to have to go back and watch it.
Absolutely. I was looking at, like, oh man, when it comes to good movies, Bill Murray is always on there. So Groundhog Day would be another great Bill Murray movie that could make a list. Yeah, Ghostbusters for sure. If we were talking about the 80s, would be on the list. If you're a fan of Bill Murray, if you like Groundhog Day, if you like Stripes, if you like Ghostbusters, check out What About Bob?
Tangent on Bill Murray. Here's a little story I'd like to share if I hadn't told you this before. So he was in the first revamp of Charlie's Angels in the early 2000s.
I remember that, yeah.
And there's a singular scene where they dress up like German singing telegrams, I guess, if you will, and they go to one of the guy's house. They need his eye scan, and so they're dressed up and they're dancing and singing, and Bill Murray's wearing a sousaphone.
Okay.
And boom, 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 right? For that one scene, it's like 25 seconds of the film. Bill Murray went to the USC tuba masterclass.
No way!
Actually learned how to play the sousaphone. And sat and listened. So masterclass, for anyone who's not a music major, very briefly, masterclass is a weekly class you go to that you play in front of your peers, and they give you feedback, and everyone talks about tips and tools on how to become a better musician on your particular instrument. So a masterclass for tubas will have like 6 people in it in a school of music. And the professor, and he went and learned to play the tuba. So when you're watching that, he may not be playing the sound you're hearing, but he's actually physically playing the tuba. And my friends who were tuba majors at the time said he was really, really funny, really nice, really gracious. So whenever I think about Bill Murray, no matter what great movie I've seen him in, because he is a fantastic actor, I think about my friends getting to teach him how to play the tuba so he can do a 30-second scene in Charlie's Angels.
Incredible!
Next on my list, Rob, I call both of these movies nerdy. They are some of my top movies of all time, nerdy literature-wise. And I'm going to start with 10 Things I Hate About You. It's very much a teen movie. It's one of the first big movies with Heath Ledger. This is where I fell in love with Heath Ledger as an actor. Of course, he's like a 20-something-year-old playing a 17-year-old, as we know Hollywood does. But 10 Things I Hate About You is at the time, modern adaptation of Taming of the Shrew. So it follows the storyline of Shakespeare very cleanly. Obviously, it's not in Shakespearean speak. Shakespeare has a renaissance about every decade at some point. And the 90s, there was certainly Shakespeare in Love with Albert Finesse, whatever his name is, and Gwyneth Paltrow. There was the Romeo and Juliet adaptation with Leonardo DiCaprio and Claire Danes, which is actually like verbatim script, but all instead of swords, they're carrying guns and modern music. I mean, beautiful soundtrack. It's a beautifully visually stunning film. Really great adaptation of Romeo and Juliet.
Another really saturated, colorful palette, if I remember correctly.
Yes. And really great interpretations of what Shakespeare's words meant, but in a culture that has guns and cars and helicopters. And I mean, it's so good. But 10 Things I Hate About You for me is even better than that because it is an adaptation without using the Shakespeare text. It's just a really good movie. It was done really well. The second on this nerdy list is Good Will Hunting. And
I love that movie.
It's so good. And it's where the world was introduced to Ben Affleck and Matt Damon. They wrote this film while they were poor and eating, ramen in a little studio in Los Angeles, trying to make it in the biz. The script is so smart. The late Robin Williams brilliantly portrays a widowed psychiatrist. I don't think they ever label exactly his counseling license, but there's a scene in here that I think about constant, lives in my brain rent free since the moment I saw the movie. And it's not the typical went to go see about a girl, which a lot of people quote from this film, but it's the scene where he first really sticks it to Will. After Will, this troubled kid, is supposed to go to jail, but because he has this brilliant mind, he's absolved from jail if he goes to therapy. And he does math stuff with this dude. Out of college, whatever. Yeah. And the therapists aren't sticking because Will can outsmart all of them. And at one point, he maybe outsmarts Robin Williams' character, but Robin Williams takes him out to the lake and they're just sitting at a bench. And he goes on this monologue about how smart Will is, but how he's just a scared little kid. I could paraphrase it. If I asked you about.
Oh, yeah. I remember this scene.
Oh, gosh. Sure. Okay, wait. I'm going to blank for a second, but because I think about it all the time. If I asked you who is it that painted this? If I asked you about Michelangelo, you could probably list for me dates and facts and figures and who he dated and what he did, but you've never stood under the Sistine Chapel and looked up and saw something angelic. If I asked you about Shakespeare, you could probably quote me some sonnets, or if I asked you about love, you could probably quote me some sonnets or read me a soliloquy, but you can't tell me what it's like to actually give your life to someone. And he just goes on this thing and it's just so beautiful. And as an educator, I think about that a lot, especially when I get into moments that are maybe tense with a student. I put myself in that place and realize you just haven't lived yet. Let's come back to some reality and let me hear what it is you're dealing with and let me help you. It's painted a lot of who I am as an educator.
Excellent movie. Definitely the first time for me that I remember Robin Williams being an actor, right? This was the guy from Mork and Mindy.
Sure. Mrs. Doubtfire
seeing this movie just absolutely blew me away. Tons of great scenes like that. For me, the one that sticks out is between Ben Affleck and Matt Damon, where they're talking about his potential, and Ben Affleck is like, the greatest day of my life is when I'm going to come to pick you up in the morning and you're not going to be there. Yeah. And that is just such a perfect metaphor or symbol for what true friendship is, or what love is.
Yeah.
It's not the selfish me loves hanging out with you every day and going to work and drinking beers. But what I really want from you is for you to succeed and for you to go and get out there and be a better person. So,
you're sitting on a lottery ticket and you're too scared to cash it in. And if 10 years from now you are still here taking your kid to Little League with my kid, I'm going to kick your ass. It's such a good, it's so well written, first of all, right? It's really paring down. We talk about nerdy. This is writing. This is literature. That movie is literature more than it is a movie. It is so good.
All right. My next movie is, in my mind, where I fell in love with comic book movies, superhero movies. Right now, we are living in just the last, whatever, it's been 10 years, 12 years of Disney, Marvel comic book movies. The first Disney comic book movie for me is The Rocketeer from 1991.
Very nice.
Love this movie. Total takeoff of it's a period piece about the 50s. It's about a guy who's a test pilot for new jet planes and all this stuff. And he gets a hold of a rocket pack, right? A jet pack. The montage that goes through making the costume and the helmet and stuff for practical purposes. I can't steer. Well, we're going to give you this helmet with a big fin on it, just like the comic books. And it's cold up there. Well, we're going to give you this cool leather jacket, just like the comic books had, and all of this stuff. And then, of course, there's Nazis and he's fighting and it's amazing. Love that movie. Love that movie on so many levels. It's just super cool. It has, I think, good pacing. I usually like a slower paced movie. Well acted, well done. Took a comic book property, gave it the movie treatment, and did an excellent job. Unlike so many other comic book adaptations that happened before our modern age, was we'll take this idea, but we'll just kind of slap it on whatever, some dumb tropey movie. This was a movie that was The Rocketeer. Absolutely love it.
It has a great soundtrack. It was visually stunning. And I remember as I got older. I don't think I appreciated it as much in the 90s. I went back and rewatched it like later. What I noticed about it is it didn't go too far into let's make it look like a comic book, which is what happened to a lot of those 90s Batman movies.
The Spider-Man ones
let's
too.
make it, yes. Or let's make it the skin of this thing, but let's write our own movie. They stayed right in the middle of that course. And that's what makes the movie so great.
Yes. Perfect. What a great observation by you. That's exactly why I like it. Is it that it is set apart in exactly those ways from the other things that were around it.
Let's be honest, Disney does not have a great record of doing that. So the fact that they did this to that movie was really impressive, and that they stuck with it and still released it. And I don't remember that. I don't know that it did well at the time in the 90s.
It's not super popular, right? It didn't lead to anything else. It didn't lead to any sequels. It didn't lead to any kind of like, oh, well, we'll do this again with another cool old comic book property. Like, I don't think it did. There was no, like, when you go to Disneyland, there's not tons of Rocketeer stuff everywhere, you know?
You know what that means, right? Popular. You know what that means? They're probably going to try to bring it back in some sort of Disney Plus form.
Sure. Let's see if it happens. I'm ready.
Talking about superhero movies or comic book movies, I just mentioned all of the Batmans that came out thanks to 1989 was the Michael Keaton Batman.
Right.
And based on that popularity, the 90s are chock full of Batman movies. There's Batman Returns. There's Batman Forever. There's Batman and Robin. There's Catwoman with Halle Berry. There's just so many Batman movies. It's a little overwhelming, and they're wholly not that great. Batman Forever, I believe, is the one with Val Kilmer as Batman. I've mentioned it before. It's not a good movie. I love watching it. It is kitschy and funny and out there. Jim Carrey as the Joker, overacting as Jim Carrey does. I love watching it. It reminds me of 90s and like high school, but there's a lot of Batman, but not a lot of good Batman.
Yes, and I, for one, would say that this also is not good Batman, but I can appreciate that you liked it. And certainly at the time, I was first in line to go see all of these Batman movies in the theater because it was the Batman movie.
Yes.
And there was always going to be something cool about it, right? What's the Batmobile going to look like this time? How's the costume going to change this time?
What are the gadgets he's going to have now that we have better technology in the late 90s than we did a decade ago? Yeah. You mentioned a good point. I know it's not a good Batman movie. I still like it. I was still also going to the theaters and excited and standing in line when you used to have to stand in line to get your tickets because they didn't sell them beforehand. So, I mean, it's all those things. It also reminds me of episode 1 when episode 1 came out in the early 2000s. Yeah. I know we're not talking about early 2000s, but it's not a good movie. But I saw it at Grauman's Chinese and one of the opening nights, like a Thursday night opening night with a bunch of my college friends. People were dressed up and just went bonkers. There are moments in that movie that still give me the chills because I can hear the audience just roaring with applause. And then, of course, as the movie goes on, it gets quieter and it gets quieter and it gets quieter. But definitely some of those are like the scene where Anakin Skywalker, this is Obi-Wan, and the crowd just went nuts because everyone knew what that eventually led out to in episode 4. But not a good movie. Batman movie is not a good movie. But for us, we were adolescents coming into being adults in the 90s. This is what we filled our time with, getting those tickets to go see those movies.
I think I was just old enough. I would think I was just too old for those Batman movies. Like the comedy and like the silliness of Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jim Carrey and those kinds of things was like, ooh, that's not great. And then, you know, of course, all of these movies led to like things like action figures and toy cars and all of that kind of stuff. But I was a little too old. Like that wasn't very exciting to me anymore either. I think we were like just a little too old to really get into the hype.
That's a good point. I feel the same about the Batman that just came out with Robert Pattinson, right? I haven't seen it yet. I know it's on HBO Max. I haven't seen it. And yet you can walk through the toy store. There's no toy stores anymore. You can walk through Target and there's all this new Batman toys and Legos and blah, blah, blah. And kids are eating it up. So yeah, I think that makes a really good point to the timing of those 90s movies.
I am going to share another 90s comedy, which is totally 90s because it stars Mike Myers, right? That's his name. Yeah. I don't know why.
Michael Myers and Mike Myers, not the mass murderer from Halloween. Yeah. Yes.
I was like, why did that sound so
That's
wrong?
Why it sounded funny.
Came out of my mouth.
It's almost Halloween and you're seeing commercials for another Halloween movie with Jamie Lee Curtis. Yes, that's why.
Okay. Mike Myers, definitely his heyday was in the 90s, coming out of Saturday Night Live, and that led to Wayne's World, like tremendously popular. But Wayne's World is not the movie on my list. The movie on my list is So I Married an Axe Murderer, 1993.
Good movie.
Just amazing movie where Mike Myers is doing his Mike Myers thing. It's the beginning of his plays multiple characters in the same movie and puts on ridiculous costumes, and talks with different funny accents, most of them Scottish. He's been doing that gig now forever, right? If the Love Guru and the one that just came out with the Pentagrion, whatever that one's called, like it's all kind of the same shtick that he does. And I think this was kind of the beginning of it. Charming movie from his family to, I mean, it's a romantic comedy, right? So there's a lot of like little cute interactions with him doing his thing, Nancy Travis falling in love with him and all that kind of stuff. And then of course there's like a twist where there's a murderer at the end and all of that kind of stuff. Mike Myers is a 90s comedian, much like Adam Sandler at the beginning of my list. So this is my favorite Mike Myers movie. And so that's why it's going on my list. I just love it. Quotable. Want to do the Scottish accents all the time, right? This was before Shrek. Before it was Shrek, it was his dad talking about haggis and, calling his grandson or whoever it was, head, move your head. Yeah. It's like Sputnik. All of these just hilarious.
Look at that baby. Get in my belly, baby.
Before it was Austin Powers, it was So I Married an Axe Murderer.
It's that same voice, same character,
family. So that's where it all began. The poetry, like intermixed in the movie, they're doing beat poetry at like the 90s coffee shop. So 90s with the turtlenecks and I ordered the large cappuccino. And of course it's this huge coffee cup that looks like a bowl. All of the just super, super 90s, very charming movie, fun to watch like on a date or even, it's pretty family friendly as well. Just a super cute movie that I love.
Well, I'm going to skip a box on my list because I also picked a Mike Myers movie. I did pick Wayne's World. Wayne's World is great. Again, quotable. There are scenes in this movie that live in my head all the time as well. I remember, I don't know why it was so funny. I mean, it's a funny scene, but I remember there was a day that you and I ditched school. We ditched like band period or something. And we went to my house and we were like eating breakfast and watching Wayne's World. And we rewound.
Why? Yes. I remember why we did that.
Yes.
Because we saw somebody eat dirt on their bike.
Yeah, that's right.
At school.
And so we're like, we need to watch Wayne's World. And we just watched that scene. Hi, Wayne. Crash into the car like 50 times, just dying laughing. And then we went back to school like the nerds that we are. So.
And then we went back to school. And as we were driving in, the teacher whose class we ditched was driving out and rolled down his window and screamed at us.
Where were you guys during school? Oh, that was good. So we had
to watch Wayne's World because a kid fell off their bike and we thought it was funny. Yeah.
Oh, we were such nerds. Moving on.
Stay in school,
Wayne's
kids.
World is great. I will say the one part that I really appreciate about Wayne's World is they also hang their hat on the trope of product placement in one of my favorite montages. We're not going to sell out, man, but look at this. Pepsi Cola. It's the choice of a new generation. And then they just go on. And what I love about this moment that's now replicated in so many comedy movies, you think they're done with it, but it keeps going. And it keeps going. It's just, Wayne's World is great. If you're not a 90s kid, you've not seen Wayne's World, it'll really show you what some of the 90s was like. And this was one of two of the most popular characters of the decade. So
I mean, I remember like the basis of that show is it's a local TV station like show that's on late at night that these two guys just produce in their basement. In the 90s, I watched a show like that. Like we had a local show called Fishmasters, which was two like long-haired, like scruffy dudes just like Wayne and Garth doing this like outlandishly, horribly produced comedy show based around fishing at one of our local lakes. Like, that's what happened in the 90s. That's what we were doing.
That is the YouTube or TikTok of our time. It was local cable shows and people who had shows on your local station for free or very low amounts of money, low budgets, people in your neighborhood. I think there's a show that I watched that was that and tried to portray itself to not be. So as I was a youth, believed it to be this big show. And as I like pop up memories of it in my head, I think it was just a local day show of this dude who was tired of commercials. His whole premise, like he's sitting in like a little thing with a table and he's like, you have seen the commercial about Huggies diapers and blah, blah, blah. So he recreates their little claim in the commercial to see if it's true. Like, here's the balloon with water and I'm going to pop it in the Huggies diaper and look, it's dripping water out of everywhere. Like, he was just so done with life that he was just grumpy old dude that did that. I just remember very vividly that show.
I worked with a guy who, before we were working together, had a public access show about like origami. It was the Origami Minute or something like that. And I had no idea. I'd never seen it before, but every once in a while we'd be out at like a restaurant or we'd be doing something and somebody'd be like, "Are you the guy from the Origami Minute?" It's like, "Oh, we know what you were doing on Thursday nights at 1:30 a.m.
Local celebrities.
Mm-hmm.
Good stuff. I think we have a movie that's the same.
We do. And I was thinking, like, as I'm sitting here staring at the list, I'm going to let you have this movie and I'm going to call an audible and replace it with a different one. A surprise.
Ooh,
a surprise
breaking the
entry.
rules. Our same movie is The Matrix, which
Yes.
we have talked about a few times throughout the podcast. The Matrix itself, if you take away our love for that movie, it was also groundbreaking in the same way Men in Black was groundbreaking. It included newer technologies used in a way. Obviously, now the CGI looks super lame, but at the time was cutting edge.
I think it still looks okay, but it's been aped and copied so many times that it looks dated now.
Maybe. Some of it has aged. Whether it's been replicated or not, you can look at it now and the more critiquing eye can see things that we didn't see in the 90s because we're so used to CGI as it exists now. But this was cutting edge. And you're right. It jump-started the use of this technology a ridiculous amount of times.
Everybody calls it bullet time, right?
Yes.
It was invented in this movie.
But this was one of those movies that you had to see in the theaters, make such a difference on the big theater screen. The shootout in the hallway heading towards the elevator is a scene that comes to my mind about it. And that was all kinds of different technologies that we hadn't seen in slow motion, fast motion. It's such a good movie. And then in itself, the story is good and the characters are intriguing and the meshing and melding of technology, which is relatively new to us at the time. People who live on the fringe of using that technology for good or bad, and the idea that there's this whole other dimension and reality, and that the reality we're living in isn't actually real. Like, there's a lot of really great stuff, science fiction wise, storytelling wise. And I think Keanu Reeves does a really great job playing Neo in this film.
I think they all do a great job. Agree with all of those things. This is on my very short list of what I would consider like a perfect movie. Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 are all bangers. I like the pacing. There's no like weird scenes that don't make sense. There's no like over the top, oh, we're going to try to inject comedy or something in here. It is something that they did that had a very direct purpose, and it had things that we were not seeing. It had a color palette that was green and gray to the point where, like, I've seen this movie 1,000 times and I know a bunch of like the little in and outs, but like on some of the like the trivia or the director's cuts and stuff, they'll talk about there'll be a scene in an alleyway where there's just a bunch of garbage and signs and stuff, and they went through all of that garbage and everything to make sure that they removed every piece of blue paint or wrapper or anything so that the color palette would just be perfect. The wire work and stuff that they were doing would have never done before. It had an aesthetic that was surreal, right? Everybody in their black leather with their cool sunglasses. We talk about the future tech, but it was really kind of alt-world tech. We were just getting into cell phones in 1999 and like, oh, you know, the smartphone is right around the corner. They didn't do a product placement thing with phones like we see in everything now. They made their own phones that when you pushed a button, they like unfolded or snapped out almost purposefully, like cocking a gun, right? Every time they pick up a phone, like check kind of thing. So there was just this real alt-world feel to it. It's got great themes. It's got good acting. It's got good writing. It's got symbolism all over the place with Neo, the One, and Trinity. Every time somebody says, oh God, or Jesus, Trinity's like, yes, you know, and you get these like things like, oh, I see what you're doing there. There's all these different symbolisms and metaphors and stuff going throughout it. And it's all consistent. Absolutely love The Matrix. I always think, like, I know in my head that it's 1999, but it seems like a 2000s movie, right?
It does.
Seems like that turn of the century type movie. Technically not a cheat. The reason I was going to take it off the list was for that reason. And also I saw that you had it, although I love it when our lists line up.
Yes.
I'm going to bring this one to you.
Okay.
1995. Rumble in the Bronx. starring
Oh
Jackie
my
Chan.
gosh, how is that not on either of our lists? What are we even doing here to not have Rumble in the Bronx on our list?
Rumble in the Bronx was my first exposure to Jackie Chan. Jackie Chan had been doing hundreds of movies overseas and coming here to the United States for years, but this is the one that was like the blockbuster, came out in the theaters while we were in high school, Jackie Chan movie. And I loved it.
Every second of it.
Never have I seen anything like what Jackie Chan can do, running up walls and these fight scenes that go on forever. And the stunts are absolutely incredible. And then at the end of the movie, there's like the bloopers of the stunts where things got wrong and he's breaking his leg and they had to make a rubber sock that looked like a sneaker for him to finish the movie, all this stuff. And this opened the door for me to where that was it. I was the Jackie Chan fan. I'm going to see all these movies. I was down there at the warehouse or Captain Video or wherever it was, getting all the Jackie Chan movies I can. I've seen just tons of them with subtitles, you know, like all this old work, and they are all bangers. They are all charming. He has had a sense of humor that comes across not only in his line reading and the way that the writing is done, but a sense of humor in the action scenes as he's beating people up and doing stunts. Oh my gosh. I think Rumble in the Bronx is kind of that first step into Jackie Chan's American fame just exploding and taking off into all of the other movies that he's done.
So we went and saw that in the theaters together. And we were with another friend of ours that knew Jackie Chan before Rumble in the Bronx. And he was talking about it forever, like, oh, Jackie Chan. We're like, whatever, we'll just go with you. You're the cool dude. We're going to go with you to see this movie. And it blew all of our minds. Safe to say it blew all of our minds in the way The Matrix did, except with the reality that Jackie Chan wasn't being CGI'd.
Nope.
Lifted. He was doing all of that stuff. And I just remember screaming and hooting and hollering in that movie forever. And then going and see it like 3 more times in the theater. And then I do remember like renting a bunch and like going over to your house or something with one of our friends and just watching some of these old subtitled movies and stuff.
We did a ton of Saturday night Jackie Chan movie watchings.
Yes. I can't believe that escaped both of our minds. Wow. Yeah. Rumble in the Bronx is great. And it still holds up. Obviously, it is timed. It's timely in its manner. Some of those things, some of that plot line wouldn't exist now with cell phones and stuff like that. But
the plot of that movie only exists to get to the
fight scenes. Yes. Yeah. Yes. So good. Rumble in the Bronx is so good. And you are right. It is Jackie Chan's introduction to the wider American audience. And then that parlayed into a bunch of other movies, good or not good, that have Jackie Chan stunts as he got older. So
that was my surprise. I think I am also next as I messed up the order, and I'm going to go with the movie from 1990. I thought it came out later, but 1990's Young Guns 2. Ooh. With Emilio Estevez, Charlie Sheen, Kiefer Sutherland, Lou Diamond Phillips, just a very 80s movies cast of characters. But I had watched as a kid a ton of Westerns, right? Because my dad liked Westerns and he liked John Wayne. And I've seen an embarrassing amount of John Wayne movies multiple times just growing up in the house that I grew up in. And that was fine, but that was kind of like a dad thing. But then I saw Young Guns 2 with these like hip young actors that, you know, were
popular at the time.
That were popular at the time, and a very modern take on the Western, right? The language was harder. The music was more electric guitar-y, but it still told a cool story about Billy the Kid and his like gang of outlaws. I absolutely loved that movie. The soundtrack for that movie is done by Bon Jovi.
Bon Jovi,
the Bon Jovi Young Guns 2 disc played a lot in my Walkman during the 90s. I probably know every word to every song on the Young Guns Bon Jovi CD.
To the casual viewer or listener to that soundtrack, that brought us Dead or Alive, right?
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. And so the whole soundtrack's Bon Jovi?
They created an entire album for the movie.
Got it.
The soundtrack, of course, is, you know, there's like the score and there's the soundtrack. The soundtrack is the Bon Jovi album. But I think Dead or Alive is the whole album is based on that movie.
Got it.
The intros and outros are quotes from the movie. They're all about Billy the Kid. They're all that. Wow. That's what they decided to do. And absolutely love it.
Yeah, it's a good one. It was at the time what Romeo and Juliet did later. It painted a certain color palette. It took popular actors who were well known for other things and put them in a time period piece. And it told a story that everyone already knew, but in a way that was visually stunning with modern music adaptation in it too.
Very good comparison. And then it was years. I probably saw Young Guns 2 10 times before I ever even watched Young Guns.
Yeah, I don't even remember the first movie, to be really honest with you.
We're almost to the end. What do you got to share with us next?
In my last box on our chart, I actually only had one movie. And as we were sitting here, I put it in there. So if you're looking at it, Rob, you won't be surprised, but I threw in My Cousin Vinny because I like comedy. And this is one that also sticks in my head a lot. This is a lot of very famous actors in a really random movie about a post Karate Kid, Ralph Macchio, as he's a little bit older, who gets in some legal trouble in the middle of like podunk nowhere, like Alabama, as he's driving from one side of the coast to the other to go to college. And he's with a friend and they get mistaken for a guy who commits murder, and they end up two kids of color in white Alabama, total fish out of water story, to be charged with murder, and they're arrested. And Ralph Macchio's character is like, hey, I have a cousin named Vinny who was studying law. Let me call my mom. Let me find out. So here comes Joe Pesci, comes on with his leather jackets and his tricked out car and his very New York girlfriend, Marissa Tomei. There we go. Tomei is not well known yet, but this is the beginning of these roles that make her famous. And she's brilliant in this role, by the way. It's such a good role for her. They're two fish out of water. There's a scene where they're like eating grits for the first time. And it's really funny. You have Fred Gwynne, who played Herman Munster in the old television show. He plays a judge. The
Frankenstein guy, the big, tall.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. He plays the judge in Alabama, and it's this comedy, family friendly about this New York judge and Joe Pesci, who's, wearing a leather jacket in court in very small town white Alabama, his nephew or his cousin, who is dark-skinned Ralph Macchio, being called a murderer, and it's not true. And he's trying to practice law, but he doesn't really practice law. He hasn't even passed the bar yet. And it's a good movie. It's got quotable lines. Talk about the two Utes all the time. If that rings familiar to you, the two Utes, the two what? The two Utes? What's a Ute? Excuse me, Your Honor. The two youths. So it's just, it plays on that kind of comedy, and it's good, and it's nerdy to me because it's law stuff, and I like law stuff. I even looked up the scene of the crime is a gas station called Soap and Suds in the middle of Podunk, Alabama. That really existed until a couple of years ago. It finally shut down. And the last couple of years it existed, it only sold memorabilia for the movie. So it's got a following. It's really funny. I like My Cousin Vinny. It's a good movie. I like it. Just watch it.
But you added another one in this category. That's the one I want to talk about.
I can't believe wasn't on my list, because to me it is ethereal and overbeing that I forgot it came out in the 90s. Shawshank Redemption.
Redemption. Morgan Freeman cranked up to 11.
Yes.
Love it.
Safe to say, my favorite movie of all time. It really is. Really? And Frank Darabont takes a story from Stephen King that many people before him tried to write into a screenplay and couldn't figure it out. Stephen King was so unenthused about Frank Darabont giving it a try that he sold him the rights for $1.
Wow.
$1. And Frank Darabont makes a masterpiece out of the story. The story is called Rita Hayworth and the Shawshank Redemption. The story itself is a really great novella. So it's a short read. This movie is almost verbatim the main character, Red, telling the story about Andy Dufresne. And I know you've even quoted this offhanded in the podcast without even thinking about it. This movie is just so beautifully done. It was not popular at the time. In all standards of movie going, it flopped. But it came out on VHS and had a second, third, fourth, fifth wind that has made it almost this cult classic now. Beautifully acted by Tim Robbins, and the entire cast is just so well cast. There's only one real deviation to the movie from the book. I'm not going to say what that is, just in case people haven't watched it or read it. There's so many things well done to this film, including Frank Darabont making sure that they chose closed down penitentiary that could be this foreboding presence in the movie. And he actually says in some director's cuts, like, that was very purposeful. He wanted almost like the jail itself was a character. Mm-hmm. For those of you who are not Stephen King fans, this prison in the literature and this area in the literature pops up all over the Stephen King world. People talk about, oh yeah, that was so-and-so. He was in Shawshank for a few years, and when he came back, he was a different man. And that's some random story or book that Stephen King wrote years later. It's just so good. Shawshank Redemption. If you haven't seen it, do yourself a favor, and it's a poignant movie. It is a lot about life and get busy living or get busy dying.
It's quotable. It's got a lot of scenes that you remember and those ideas that go through it with his escape and his systems, the way he deals with people. Of course, Morgan Freeman being Morgan Freeman. I have this movie in the same file drawer in my brain as another awesome 90s movie that should be on the list, which is Field of Dreams.
Oh,
Both
sure.
Shawshank Redemption and Field of Dreams are movies that would come on television on like Saturday and Sunday afternoons. For whatever reason, I just have this space is full of those two movies. And those are two movies that like, oh, okay, it's Sunday and I'm cleaning up my room and I'm whatever, organizing my comic books or something, but the TV would be on and like, boom, it's either Shawshank Redemption or it's Field of Dreams.
Yeah.
And either one, it's, well, this is what I'm doing this afternoon, and I'm going to plunk down for the next 3.5 hours because they put commercials in it back when movies were on TV and watch Shawshank Redemption.
Frank Darabont did some things unusual to a movie. And of course, all this now because of DVD extras and things like that. But one of the things that really stuck with me is Morgan Freeman saying that when they did these long shots or these overhead shots, like of them sitting on the roof drinking a beer, that the guard bought them because Andy Dufresne helped them out with some tax paperwork.
Right.
As they were doing this long shot, they actually played Morgan Freeman's voiceover over it. So there's just this sense of the actors understanding what's happening in that moment to the longer. It's like a little bit like Sixth Sense. You see that the second or third time because now you know the secret. Now you know the result. One of my favorite moments in this whole movie is how they unveil, spoiler if you haven't seen it, and shame on you if you haven't seen it, but how they unveil the warden figuring out how Andy Dufresne got out. To me, that shot of him tossing the rock at that poster and it just going through, and how beautifully acted on all of their faces, how he puts his hand in and rips that poster out, and then you get the point of view from inside the hole and all of them looking. I mean, beautifully done. That's just beautiful movie making.
Yes. From the dirt coming out of the shoe to the throwing the rock through the poster. Like it's so it's tense, right? Your heart starts beating faster. It's so good.
And then how they unveil all of that. They go backwards to go forwards on Andy's escape. No matter what I'm doing, because I'll do the same thing. I have this movie on a lot more than I would care to admit. I always stop and watch that sequence. I can hear the tempo of what's going on. Oh, here it comes. I'm going to go stop holding clothes. I'm going to stop vacuuming. I'm going to sit and watch this scene. It is so good. I will say this is my favorite movie of all time and one of my favorite Stephen King stories. And for me, there's a lot of intersectionality there in the first place for it to be such a good movie. But also Stephen King. So also a little bit of that, like Stephen King, he doesn't write all horror, but he writes a very particular type of twist in all of his stories and books and novels. It's all of that wrapped into just a really beautifully made movie.
Excellent, man. That is incredible. I'm going to just throw one more in real quick. This is again from 1999, starring all kinds of your 90s Jennifer Aniston, Harry Connick Jr., Vin Diesel are in this movie. Gosh. But you don't really notice that they are because this is an animated film and they are not playing themselves, right? Those actors usually have quite a screen presence of like, oh, this is Jennifer Aniston. It's a Jennifer Aniston movie. Or, Vin Diesel's in this movie. This is going to be like a Vin Diesel movie with stunts and loud music and explosions and stuff. It is none of that. These characters just do quiet, good acting voiceovers for this animated movie, The Iron Giant. The Iron Giant is a movie that came out in 1999. I definitely did not see it in 1999. It totally passed me by. And then years later, I think someone recommended it, was talking about it, or it was just one of those things where I'm like, how come I've never seen that movie? And then I watched it and it became one of my absolute favorites, one of my go-tos, one of the first movies that, I wanted to watch with my son when he was a little older and getting into things like giant robots and superheroes and cool things like that. It's another period piece that takes place in the 50s, very similar to The Rocketeer now that I'm looking at them both at the same time. But it's one of those, something crash lands from space and it blows up and this little town has this secret and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and the army shows up and they want to fight it because it's a big monster, but there's all these different layers to it. The kid is fantastic. The mom does great. There's the beatnik character in there that helps him out, which is the Harry Connick Jr. character. It's just everything about it is charming. All the characters are fantastic. Oh, it's also got, what's his name? Shooter McGavin.
Christopher McDonald.
He is the antagonist of the story, and his voice also carries as far as that 90s nostalgia and stuff. Another one of these movies that is just a perfect movie. I like a little bit slower of a pace movie. I get that. I hear that from the youths all the time. That movie was slow. That movie was boring. I'm like, no, you have to be patient. Let the story tell itself and its own. But just absolutely fantastic movie. I don't want to spoiler alert too bad for future episodes this season.
Oh, sure.
But we will talk about this movie again in an upcoming episode.
Right on. Well, I actually haven't seen this. It's animated, right?
It is an animated movie. You can get it on HBO Max right now if you want. That's where I most recently watched it. Okay. And I would say if you've got the time, drop what you're doing and go watch Iron Giant.
Yeah, there's a lot of really big actors in this.
Yeah, I'm surprised how little exposure it has. I don't know what the marketing was or what the timing. Maybe it was up against something. Maybe it was up against The Matrix and nobody
The Matrix,
saw
probably, yeah.
I'm not sure, but it is an incredible movie that I'm shocked does not have more notoriety than it does.
Wow. I'm going to have to watch this. It looks really good.
Yes.
I don't know that I even heard of it.
Go watch Iron Giant and write in for next week's Nerd Best Friends episode and tell me what you thought.
And that is our list of 90s nerd movies.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Rob, it's that time. What's the nerdiest thing you did this week?
All right. The nerdiest thing I did this week, I had two little stories to share. The first one will be real quick. I think I talked last season about how much I was enjoying 3D printing and painting up dice towers. I've backed a few Kickstarters that were exclusively dice towers. I probably have 25 different dice towers that I could make and paint up. And so for a while I was doing that. I gave some out for gifts and things. And just recently a person in one of my D&D groups, great guy, I've actually never met in person because of online. He's like, hey, you were talking about dice towers. Do you? And I'm like, oh my God, dude. And I start holding things up to the screen. Which one do you want? I was so happy. I don't know if you remember that gigantic Dark Tower one.
Oh yeah. That one's beautiful.
He wanted that one. And so I spent tons of time with the bubble wrap and the peanuts and just the newspaper and trying to make sure that it wasn't going to break on the way there. Sent it off to a friend and that made me very happy. But the nerdiest thing that I did this week
wasn't nerdy enough.
That wasn't nerdy enough.
Yes.
The thing that I did that I felt was super nerdy was I've also talked about my love for really useful boxes and how I've organized my closets with theirs and the interlocking. They make little tiny ones.
Mm-hmm.
They make these super cute little tiny ones. And yep, that size. Does it say on the front? It's like a
Oh yeah, it's a really useful box. I remember I told
really
you when we were
box.
talking about them, I've been using these for years because they had them at Container Store, and when I lived in Vegas, there was a Container Store.
So have you seen that they now come with a rack that you can slide 12 of those in, and it's a little carrying case?
What?
So I got one of those, and our friend who does the father-sons D&D games on Friday nights or Saturday nights, he's running Descent into Avernus, which is a published Dungeons & Dragons campaign. And I always bring the miniatures, and I was kind of bemoaning the fact one time a couple weeks ago, I was like, oh man, I could have had this ready for you if you had told me with more notice. Like I had the miniatures, but they weren't painted, or, oh man, I really want that miniature anyway, but there's not enough time to order it and get it here on time. So he went through the whole adventure and put together a list of all the miniatures that he's going to need to finish up the campaign. And I got one of those racks of all the little tiny, really useful boxes. And I used my label maker and I labeled them all like what they were going to be. And I gathered up my minis and I made a big spreadsheet and a list of what I already owned and what was painted and then what was boxed with check boxes and everything. And so now, when it's time to go to that game, I just grab my rack of super cute, tiny, really useful boxes that are all labeled, take it over to his house, put it there next to his side of the table. And when he's ready, he just goes, oh, let's see, I need the dretches. And there they are, pulls them out. We're good. Absolutely.
That's amazing.
An absolute victory.
Well, let's also say, now that you've told me about this is what I just pulled out of my nerd closet here. I have a set of dice in for emergency need. If I need an extra D6 or something while we're playing, I just grab this one. Or there's been a couple of times when we're playing masks that I forgot to get dice out. So I just grab this box real quick and roll this D6 twice.
The emergency dice box.
It's my emergency dice box, which when I was in a classroom, this had paper clips or who knows what else, little erasers or something in it. Knowing that you can fit maybe 2 sets of good dice in it. Can you imagine a whole rack? Rainbow dice, our cool's dice, blah, blah. I'm starting to think I don't need more projects. Thanks, Rob.
Okay. Nerdiest thing you did this week, Analese.
So I did something for my physical well-being that I thought was pretty nerdy. I tried cryotherapy this week. So I joined a gym thing for 3 months.
Cryotherapy. You said Cairo.
Yes, I like.
And I don't think it's therapy that has to do with Egypt. I think it's cryotherapy.
Yes, you're correct.
Cryo.
There. Obviously, I'm not well versed in what this is, but I joined this gym. It's just to kind of jumpstart being physical again. And they gave these 2 little coupons. Here's for the stretch lab in Montecito, and you can go and get stretched for 25 minutes. And here's this to this place. And so I called them yeah, I don't know what this is, but I want to use this free coupon before it expires. And they're like, come on, and we'll explain to you, blah, blah. So yeah, they put you in this chamber that's negative 150 degrees, and it's all nitrogen.
Yeah, Maria wants to do this. Maria has talked about wanting to do this, so she'll want to hear about your experience.
It's amazing. First of all, it's amazing. So I had these coupons, and I had forgotten about them, and so I'm cleaning out my wallet, and I pull these out of my wallet, and they expire next week. So I call and make an appointment. It ends up being on a very hectic day of the school year, and so I'm running late and all frantic, and I go in, and there's one other person there, and it ends up being someone that goes to the gym at 5:30 in the morning with me, and we're like, oh, hey, you're 5:30. And so neither of us had done it before. The salesperson who was there was really great and talked us through, but you basically strip down to your underwear, you put these long socks on, they give you gloves and they give you a rope, and then you get the chamber cold, and they give you all these instructions don't look down and breathe in the nitrogen, keep your head up, and there's this little platform so your head is sticking out, and you take off all your metal and your smartwatch and all the things, and you go in there and you kind of walk in a little circle because the cold just comes out of one area, so you don't want it just to hit that one area. I will tell you this, it made me thankful that I lived in Toledo, Ohio for 4 years, because it was not as cold as a Friday or Saturday night football game in November where I was wearing 5 layers of clothing and still couldn't feel my fingers. So the cold for me wasn't that bad, but it did all the things. It hurt most. I felt it the most in places I was inflamed, like my knees, like my back. And so that's where the cold really attacked. And afterwards, it feels like you're thawing out pins and needles. And that felt really good. But I was energized. You burn a ton of calories when you do that. So I was super hungry, drank a ton of water after, and went to my workout the next morning. That felt really great. It was really, really good. And I know you read the little pamphlet and it talks about like weight loss stuff and it freezes, fat cells and burns them faster and stuff like that. I don't know about any of that, but what I can say is that I slept really well that night and I felt really great for like 2 days after. Yeah, I kind of nerded out. Like my friend who was also the 5:30 a.m. gym person, I kind of thought of like Han Solo.
That's what I was gonna ask. Like, it's only nerdy. Like, when you step in, does the person there look at you and just like knowingly say, "I love you," so you can say,
"It's kind of
I
like,
know," and then they turn it on.
Yes, or like, yeah, I kept joking with my partner that I was going to become Frozone
for The
Incredibles. Frozone, yeah. I'm like, I'm going to come home and I'm going to be Frozone, and she's like, what? And I'm like, never mind. But yeah, no, it was an experience. It was really good. I felt super nerdy about it, and I thought I'd share it because that felt like a unique experience, a unique nerd experience to share with the world. You should try it. I recommend it.
Well, I know Maria wants to, so if you talk her up and say that you survived and then it was good, I'm sure that'll be just enough to push her over the edge to try it.
Yeah, I might even go again. Like I said, my knees felt really good for a couple of days, and that just comes with.
Well, I'll go with you so that when you step in, you can say "I love you," and I'll say "I know," and then we'll flip on the machine for the whole. We'll record it and we'll put it up. It'll be great.
And you can mix nerdisms and start playing the theme from Titanic behind it too.
There you go.
So next episode, we will cover the multiverse of the one and only Man of Steel. It's a bird. It's a plane. No, it's a podcast about Superman.
Oh boy, that means I've got some work to do this next week, making sure I've got all of my T's crossed and my big letter S's capitalized. Remember to subscribe, share, and give us that 5-star rating wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, @NerdBestFriends, or send messages by writing to podcast@nerdbestfriends.com.
Thanks for listening, everyone. Rob, as always, I love nerding out with you about stuff.
Totally radical, dude. The musical with the plant and the guy with Rick Moranis.
Oh, Little Shop of Horrors.
Thank you. And why do we talk about movies and TV? I don't know.
I should just have it open.
I don't know anything about actors.
The actor that plays Eddie Munster in the not Eddie Munster. God dang it. Hold on.
Eddie Munster from the Munsters?
He plays.
I mean, it could be.
Is that the father's name? Eddie Munster's the kid.
No, Eddie's the kid.
The father. He plays the father. Hold on.
In the Munsters?
Yes, he does. Hold on.
Wait, the grandpa was the vampire guy.
Right. The main father guy is the judge in My Cousin Vinny. Hold on.